The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Sarah, a flight attendant with over 10 years of experience, prepared for another day at work. She had seen it all: rowdy passengers, crying babies, and even medical emergencies mid-flight. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold on Flight 342 from New York to Los Angeles. It was supposed to be just another routine trip, but sometimes life has a way of turning the ordinary into something unforgettable. As passengers began boarding, Sarah stood near the entrance, greeting them with practiced smiles and polite nods. The cabin slowly filled with people chatting, laughing, or scrolling through their phones. Among the crowd were Marcus and Michael Johnson, identical twins who looked strikingly similar except for the small scar above Marcus's eyebrow. They were young entrepreneurs returning home after attending a tech conference where they'd showcase their innovative app designed to help small businesses grow. Dressed in hoodies and sneakers, they blended right in with the casual vibe of most travelers. Sarah noticed the twins almost immediately. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about them. They seemed like regular guys settling into their seats, but something about their appearance caught her attention. Maybe it was the way they wore their hoodies pulled up slightly, or perhaps it was how they moved confidently down the aisle despite being young and seemingly out of place in business class. Whatever it was, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She tried to brush off her thoughts, telling herself she was probably overthinking things. After all, she dealt with hundreds of passengers every week, and jumping to conclusions was never helpful. Still, her mind kept wandering back to stereotypes she'd heard before. Stories about suspicious behavior, or people who didn't belong. Deep down, she knew those ideas weren't fair, but old habits die hard, and Sarah found herself watching the twins more closely than anyone else on the plane. Meanwhile, Marcus and Michael were completely unaware of the silent drama unfolding around them. They joked quietly about the long flight ahead, discussing plans to binge-watch their favorite show once they got comfortable. For them, this was just another leg of their journey, a chance to relax after days of networking and pitching their idea to potential investors. Little did they know, their presence on this flight would soon become the center of a national controversy. As the last few passengers took their seats and the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Was it really their clothes, their age, or was it something deeper, something rooted in biases she didn't even realize she carried? Whatever the reason, one thing was certain: Sarah's next decision would change not only her life, but also the lives of everyone on board. And so, as the engines roared to life and the plane sped down the runway, no one could have guessed that the calm atmosphere inside the cabin was about to shatter into chaos. What happened next would leave some questioning their beliefs, others demanding justice, and everyone wondering how such a simple misunderstanding could spiral so quickly out of control. As the plane taxied down the runway, Sarah's unease only grew stronger. She couldn't stop glancing at Marcus and Michael, who were seated a few rows ahead of her. They seemed completely at ease, chatting softly and adjusting their seatbelts like any other passengers. But to Sarah, every movement they made felt exaggerated, as if they were trying too hard to appear normal. When Marcus leaned over to tuck his backpack under the seat in front of him, Sarah's suspicions flared. To her, it looked deliberate, almost calculated. She didn't realize that he was simply making sure his bag wasn't sticking out into the aisle. Her mind raced with questions. Why were two young men dressed so casually sitting in business class? Had they saved up for months to afford these tickets, or was there another explanation? What if they weren't supposed to be here at all? The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something wasn't right. It didn't help that their hoodies reminded her of news reports she'd seen years ago. Stories she now realized were based on stereotypes rather than facts. Still, those images lingered in her memory, clouding her judgment. Determined to get answers, Sarah decided to approach them under the pretense of checking seatbelts, a standard safety procedure before takeoff. She walked down the aisle with a forced smile, stopping beside their seats. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Are you sure these seats are yours?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the question. He pulled out his boarding pass and showed it to her without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "We're in 14A and 14B. Sarah studied the boarding passes carefully, searching for any sign of tampering or fraud. But everything checked out. They were legitimate tickets. Still, instead of walking away, she lingered, asking follow-up questions. "Did you book these yourselves?" she pressed, her voice tinged with skepticism. This time, Michael responded, his tone still calm, but with a hint of defensiveness creeping in. "Yes, we did. Is there a problem?" The twins exchanged a glance, confused by the line of questioning. They had flown dozens of times before and never encountered anything like this. Sure, people sometimes questioned why two young black men would be traveling in business class, but no one had ever interrogated them quite so thoroughly. For Sarah, however, the exchange only deepened her doubts. Their politeness felt rehearsed to her, their answers too smooth. She told herself she was being cautious, for the safety of everyone on board. But in reality, her biases were steering her actions. Unwilling to let the matter drop, Sarah returned to the galley and picked up the intercom phone. Her heart pounded as she dialed the cockpit, requesting to speak with the captain. "There's something I need to report," she began hesitantly. "Two passengers. I'm not sure they belong here. Their behavior seems suspicious." On the other end, the captain listened intently, aware of the weight of such claims. After a brief pause, he agreed to investigate further. By the time Sarah hung up, her hands were trembling. Part of her wondered if she'd overreacted, but another part clung to the belief that she was doing the right thing. Passengers nearby had started to notice the tension brewing. Some craned their necks to see what was happening, while others pretended not to look. The hum of conversation faded slightly, replaced by an uneasy silence that spread through the cabin like a shadow. Moments later, the plane came to an abrupt stop on the tarmac. Over the intercom, the captain announced that there would be a short delay due to an operational issue. No one knew exactly what was going on, but the mood shifted instantly. Anxiety rippled through the air as ground staff boarded the aircraft, heading straight for Marcus and Michael. The twins watched in disbelief as they were asked to gather their belongings and leave the plane. For Marcus and Michael, the situation felt surreal. One minute, they were settling into their seats, ready to relax after a long week. The next, they were being escorted off the plane in front of nearly 100 strangers. They complied quietly, refusing to cause a scene, but inside, anger and humiliation burned brightly. As they stepped off the plane, Sarah watched from afar, her expression unreadable. She told herself this was proof she'd made the right call. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered otherwise. And as the door closed behind the twins, sealing them off from the flight, none of them could have predicted how quickly the repercussions would unfold. The moment Marcus and Michael stepped off the plane, they were met with confused stares from the ground staff waiting on the tarmac. The cool morning breeze hit their faces as they carried their backpacks, still trying to process what had just happened. They weren't given much of an explanation, just a vague statement about security concerns that left them feeling more frustrated than informed. As they walked away from the aircraft, escorted by two uniformed employees, they couldn't help but notice how surreal the scene felt. Passengers inside pressed their faces against the windows, watching silently as the twins disappeared into the terminal. For Marcus and Michael, the humiliation was overwhelming. They had done nothing wrong. No argument, no disturbance, not even a raised voice, and yet they were being treated like criminals. The weight of the situation settled heavily on their shoulders. People around them seemed unsure of what to say or do. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others offered sympathetic glances. One older woman approached them briefly, saying softly, "I'm sorry this happened to you," before hurrying away. Her words, though kind, did little to ease the sting of injustice. Back on the plane, passengers began whispering among themselves. A few defended the decision, agreeing that safety should always come first, while others openly criticized the airline's actions. "They didn't do anything wrong," muttered a man in row 12, shaking his head. "It's ridiculous." His neighbor nodded in agreement, adding, "This feels personal." Slowly but surely, the murmurs grew louder, creating an undercurrent of tension that filled the cabin. Sarah, standing near the galley, overheard bits and pieces of the conversations. At first, she tried to ignore them, telling herself she'd done the right thing. But the growing dissent made her uneasy. Meanwhile, the captain faced mounting pressure to explain the delay. Over the intercom, he reassured everyone that the issue was being resolved quickly, but his vague statements only fueled speculation. Passengers started piecing things together. The sudden stop, the ground staff boarding, and now the absence of the two young men who had been sitting in business class. It didn't take long for someone to connect the dots. A teenager seated near the window turned to her mother and whispered, "Do you think those guys got kicked off because they're black?" The question hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. As the plane prepared for takeoff once again, the atmosphere remained charged. Some passengers scrolled through their phones, searching for news updates or sharing theories online. Others sat quietly, lost in thought, wondering if they should have spoken up when the twins were removed. For Sarah, the guilt gnawed at her, though she refused to admit it, even to herself. She busied herself with pre-flight tasks, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might challenge her decisions. Yet, despite her efforts to stay composed, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus and Michael walking off the plane, their expressions a mix of confusion and hurt. Once back in the terminal, Marcus and Michael wasted no time. They found a quiet corner and pulled out their phones, determined to share their story with the world. Within minutes, they recorded a video detailing everything that had happened, from Sarah's intrusive questions to their forced removal. "We didn't cause any trouble," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "We were just sitting there, minding our own business, and suddenly we're being treated like we don't belong." Michael added, "This isn't just about us. It's about how people are judged based on appearances instead of actions." They posted the video on social media, tagging the airline and using hashtags like #racial profiling and #justiceforall. Almost immediately, reactions poured in. Friends, family, and strangers alike expressed outrage, calling for accountability and change. The post gained traction rapidly, sparking debates across platforms. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying the twins' voices and shining a spotlight on the incident. By the time the plane finally took off without them, Marcus and Michael's ordeal had already begun making waves far beyond the airport. What neither the twins nor Sarah realized was that this was only the beginning. The ripple effects of their encounter would soon reach far wider than anyone could have anticipated, forcing everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, fairness, and the power of public opinion. And as the hours ticked by, the airline braced itself for the storm that was about to hit, not just from angry customers, but from a society demanding answers. Within hours, Marcus and Michael's video had gone viral. It wasn't just their calm and articulate recounting of the incident that captured people's attention. It was the raw emotion behind it. The frustration in Marcus's voice as he described being questioned for no reason. The quiet anger in Michael's eyes as he talked about how they were singled out simply because of how they looked. Their words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom shared similar experiences of bias and discrimination. Comments flooded in from all corners of the internet, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of unfair treatment at airports or on planes. The hashtags #JusticeForTheJohnson Twins and #StopRacial Profiling began trending nationwide, drawing even more attention to the situation. Journalists quickly picked up the story, reaching out to Marcus and Michael for interviews. News outlets aired clips of their video, alongside commentary from experts on racial profiling and civil rights. Social media influencers joined the conversation, amplifying the twins' message to millions of followers. What started as a personal grievance had transformed into a national debate about systemic inequality and prejudice in everyday life. Meanwhile, passengers who had been on the flight also began speaking out. One woman posted a thread on Twitter describing how she'd witnessed Sarah's behavior firsthand, calling it unnecessarily aggressive and rooted in bias. Others chimed in, recalling moments when they too had felt uneasy observing the interaction. A man in business class wrote, "I didn't say anything at the time, but now I regret staying silent. This isn't okay." These accounts added fuel to the fire, painting a clearer picture of what had happened and putting immense pressure on the airline to respond. The backlash hit the airline hard. Calls poured into customer service lines, emails flooded executive inboxes, and social media mentions spiked dramatically. Critics demanded answers. Why were Marcus and Michael removed? What evidence justified their removal? Was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern? The company's initial statement, a generic apology citing operational delays, only angered people further. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, holding signs that read, "Safety doesn't mean discrimination," and "Bias has no place in the sky." Behind closed doors, executives scrambled to address the crisis. Emergency meetings were held late into the night as teams brainstormed ways to mitigate the damage. Public relations specialists urged transparency, warning that attempts to downplay the incident would only worsen public perception. Legal advisors cautioned against admitting fault prematurely, fearing potential lawsuits. Meanwhile, employees like Sarah watched nervously, unsure of what consequences might follow. Amidst the chaos, Marcus and Michael remained focused. They hired a prominent civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile cases involving racial injustice. Their lawyer issued a formal complaint against the airline, outlining not only the emotional distress caused by the incident, but also the broader implications of allowing such behavior to go unchecked. "This isn't just about two individuals," the attorney stated during a press conference. "It's about holding institutions accountable for perpetuating harmful stereotypes." As the days passed, the story continued to dominate headlines. Talk shows invited guests to discuss racial profiling in aviation, while opinion pieces debated whether airlines needed stricter policies to prevent bias-based decisions. Even celebrities weighed in, using their platforms to call for change. The sheer magnitude of the response caught everyone off guard, including the airline itself. Executives realized this wasn't something they could sweep under the rug. The world was watching, and expectations for accountability were higher than ever. For Sarah, the whirlwind of attention was suffocating. She saw her name mentioned in articles and heard snippets of conversations criticizing her actions. At first, she tried to defend herself, telling colleagues that she had acted out of concern for safety. But as the criticism mounted, her confidence wavered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake, one that might cost her everything. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, no one could have predicted just how swiftly the fallout would come. The stage was set for a reckoning. The airline knew it had to act decisively if it wanted to salvage its reputation. For Marcus and Michael, the fight was far from over, but their courage had already sparked a movement. People across the country were talking about issues they had long ignored, forcing uncomfortable yet necessary conversations about. The airline's internal investigation began almost immediately, but the process was anything but smooth. Executives knew they had to act quickly to address the growing public outcry, yet every step forward seemed to uncover more complications. Investigators reviewed security footage from the boarding process and inside the cabin, searching for any evidence that could clarify what had happened. They also interviewed passengers who had been on the flight, many of whom were eager to share their perspectives. One passenger, an older man seated near Marcus and Michael, recalled how Sarah had hovered around the twin seats multiple times before confronting them. "It felt like she was targeting them specifically," he said during his interview. Another traveler, a young woman in economy class, described overhearing Sarah's call to the captain. She kept saying things like, "They don't look right," or "They seem out of place." The woman explained, "But honestly, they look just like anyone else on the plane." As more accounts surfaced, inconsistencies in Sarah's version of events became glaringly obvious. While she claimed the twins' behavior had been suspicious, none of the passengers corroborated her description. Instead, they painted a picture of two young men simply minding their own business. One family even mentioned seeing Marcus helping a child retrieve a toy that had rolled under his seat, a small act of kindness that contradicted Sarah's portrayal of him as a potential threat. Despite the mounting evidence against her, Sarah remained steadfast in her defense. During her meeting with investigators, she insisted she had acted out of concern for everyone's safety. "I've been doing this job for over 10 years, and I know when something feels off," she argued. "I wasn't trying to discriminate. I was following protocol." Her tone was firm, but there were moments when her voice wavered, betraying the cracks in her confidence. When pressed about why she hadn't flagged other passengers whose behavior might have raised similar concerns, she struggled to provide a clear answer. Executives listened intently as details emerged, weighing the implications of each finding. On one hand, Sarah's actions appeared to violate company policies emphasizing fairness and professionalism. On the other hand, firing a longtime employee carried its own risks, especially if it came across as scapegoating rather than accountability. The decision weighed heavily on them, knowing that whatever choice they made would set a precedent for how the airline handled future incidents. Meanwhile, Marcus and Michael continued to advocate for systemic change. With their attorney by their side, they pushed for transparency throughout the investigation, demanding that the airline release findings publicly. They also called for mandatory anti-bias training for all employees, arguing that education was key to preventing similar situations in the future. Their persistence resonated with supporters, who rallied behind their cause both online and offline. Back at work, Sarah tried to carry on as usual, but the weight of the scrutiny was unbearable. Colleagues avoided discussing the incident with her, unsure of what to say. Some offered quiet support, while others distanced themselves entirely. Rumors swirled about whether she would be fired, suspended, or let off with a warning. Each day felt longer than the last as she waited anxiously for news about her fate. Finally, after days of deliberation, executives reached a decision. They concluded that Sarah's actions not only violated company policy, but also contributed to the toxic narrative surrounding the incident. Her conduct, they determined, was unprofessional and damaging to the airline's reputation. Though difficult, they agreed that termination was the only option that aligned with their commitment to accountability and reform. When Sarah was summoned to a private meeting to hear the verdict, her heart sank. As executives explained their decision, she sat silently, her face pale with disbelief. She had expected consequences, but nothing this severe. Just 60 seconds after delivering her final statement, her last attempt to justify her actions, she was officially terminated. The room fell silent as the reality of the moment settled in. For Sarah, it marked the end of a career she had dedicated over a decade of her life to building. And for the airline, it signaled the beginning of a long journey toward rebuilding trust, not just with Marcus and Michael, but with the countless others affected by bias and discrimination. The news of Sarah's termination spread like wildfire, first within the airline's internal circles, and then to the public. Reporters somehow got wind of the decision, and soon headlines blared. "Flight attendant fired after removing black twins from plane." The story dominated every major news outlet, sparking a fresh wave of reactions across social media and beyond. Some people applauded the airline for taking swift action, calling it a necessary step toward accountability. Others, however, rushed to defend Sarah, arguing that she was being unfairly punished for what they saw as a simple mistake. Sarah herself struggled to process the whirlwind of emotions that followed her dismissal. At first, she felt numb, unable to believe that her decades-long career had ended so abruptly. Her confidence shattered, replaced by shame and regret. She replayed the events in her mind over and over, questioning whether she could have handled things differently. What if she had ignored her gut feeling? What if she had given Marcus and Michael the benefit of the doubt instead of jumping to conclusions? These questions haunted her, but there was no going back now. Without her job, Sarah found herself adrift. For years, her identity had been tied to her role as a flight attendant, a profession she once took pride in. Now, stripped of that title, she felt lost. She applied for jobs in other industries, hoping to start anew, but each rejection letter chipped away at her self-esteem. Friends and family tried to offer support, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes, but their words offered little comfort. Slowly, Sarah began withdrawing from those around her, retreating into solitude as she grappled with guilt and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Marcus and Michael continued to use their platform to drive meaningful change. They partnered with advocacy groups focused on racial equity, speaking at conferences and workshops about their experience. Their message was clear: systemic bias isn't just an individual problem. It's a societal one that requires collective effort to address. They pushed for airlines to implement mandatory anti-bias training programs, not just for flight attendants, but for all employees who interact with passengers. Their persistence paid off when the airline announced plans to roll out comprehensive diversity initiatives, crediting the twins for inspiring the reforms. Public opinion remained divided, reflecting the broader complexities of the issue. Some viewed Sarah as a scapegoat, believing the airline had sacrificed her to save face. Online forums buzzed with debates about personal responsibility versus institutional failure. One commenter wrote, "She made a bad call, yes, but firing her doesn't fix the bigger problem." Another countered, "Accountability starts somewhere. If we don't hold individuals responsible, nothing will ever change." Despite the mixed reactions, the incident forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and privilege. Conversations that might have stayed hidden bubbled to the surface, challenging people to examine their own assumptions and behaviors. For some, it was an awakening. For others, a source of defensiveness. Either way, the dialogue sparked by Marcus and Michael's ordeal showed no signs of fading anytime soon. As weeks turned into months, Sarah began to find small ways to rebuild her life. She took up volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young adults interested in pursuing careers in hospitality. Teaching gave her a renewed sense of purpose, even though it wasn't the same as flying. Over time, she started noticing subtle shifts in her perspective. Interacting with people from diverse backgrounds helped her see the world through a different lens, one less clouded by stereotypes and preconceived notions. Though Sarah never publicly apologized to Marcus and Michael, those closest to her noticed changes in her behavior. She became more mindful of how she treated others, striving to approach every interaction with empathy rather than judgment. It wasn't redemption in the traditional sense, but it was progress, a small step toward healing the wounds caused by her actions. For Marcus and Michael, the journey was far from over. While they celebrated the victories they'd achieved, they knew the fight against systemic bias was ongoing. Their story served as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, a reminder that courage and resilience can spark change, even in the face of adversity. And though the scars left by that fateful flight would always remain, they stood as proof that even the most painful experiences can lead to growth, if we're willing to learn from them. Months after the incident, Marcus and Michael found themselves standing on a stage at a national summit on diversity and inclusion. The room was packed with attendees, business leaders, activists, educators, and students, all eager to hear their story. As they stepped up to the microphone, the brothers exchanged a quick glance, silently reminding each other how far they had come since that day on the plane. What had started as a personal ordeal had grown into something much bigger, a movement for change. Marcus began by recounting the events of the flight in vivid detail, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He described the humiliation of being questioned without cause, the frustration of being removed from the plane, and the anger that followed when they realized it wasn't just about them. It was about a pattern of bias that many people face daily. "We didn't choose this fight," he said, pausing to let his words sink in. But we're not backing down either. Michael took over, shifting the focus to solutions. He talked about the importance of education, sharing stories from their advocacy work with airlines and organizations striving to combat racial profiling. Change starts with awareness, he explained. You can't fix what you don't acknowledge. Their message resonated deeply with the audience, earning applause that rippled through the auditorium like waves. For Marcus and Michael, it was validation that their efforts were making an impact, not just for themselves, but for countless others who felt unseen or unheard. Back at the airline, the reforms inspired by the twins' case were beginning to take shape. Mandatory anti-bias training sessions became a cornerstone of employee development programs, designed not only to educate staff, but also to foster empathy and understanding. Posters promoting inclusivity appeared in break rooms and boarding areas, serving as constant reminders of the company's renewed commitment to fairness. Passengers noticed the shift too. Some reported feeling more respected during interactions with crew members, while others praised the airline for taking meaningful steps toward progress. For Sarah, life continued to be a mix of struggle and growth. After months of searching, she finally landed a job at a local cafe, a far cry from her days as a flight attendant, but one that allowed her to interact with people in a simpler, less scrutinized environment. Serving coffee and chatting with customers gave her a fresh perspective on human connection. She learned to listen more and judge less, slowly shedding the biases that had once clouded her judgment. Though she rarely spoke about the incident, those close to her could see she was trying to do better. And sometimes, effort matters as much as outcome. Still, Sarah couldn't escape the shadow of her past completely. Former colleagues occasionally reached out, updating her on changes within the airline industry. One friend told her about a new policy requiring employees to document any passenger-related concerns before escalating them. "It's because of what happened with you," the friend admitted awkwardly. Sarah nodded quietly, realizing that her actions, though misguided, had sparked important conversations. While it didn't erase her guilt, it gave her a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, something good had come out of all the chaos. As time passed, Marcus and Michael's story continued to inspire others. Social media posts praising their resilience popped up regularly, often accompanied by hashtags like #CourageinAction and #BreakingBias. Schools invited them to speak to students about standing up against injustice, while companies sought their advice on creating inclusive workplaces. They became symbols of perseverance, proving that even ordinary individuals can drive extraordinary change when they refuse to stay silent. The journey hadn't been easy for anyone involved, but it had taught everyone valuable lessons. For Marcus and Michael, it reinforced the power of using your voice to challenge inequality. For Sarah, it highlighted the importance of self-reflection and accountability. And for society as a whole, it served as a reminder that progress is possible, even in the face of deeply ingrained prejudices. It wouldn't happen overnight, but every step forward mattered. By the end of the summit, Marcus closed with a powerful statement. "This isn't just our story, it's everyone's story. We all have a role to play in building a world where no one has to feel out of place simply because of who they are." As the crowd erupted into applause, the twins stepped off the stage, knowing their work was far from finished. But for now, they allowed themselves a moment to celebrate how far they, and so many others, had come. Months turned into a year, and the ripple effects of that fateful flight continued to shape lives in ways no one could have predicted. Marcus and Michael had become household names, not just for their ordeal, but for the positive change they inspired. Their advocacy work reached new heights as they collaborated with lawmakers to draft policies aimed at reducing racial profiling in public spaces, including airports. Airlines across the country began adopting stricter guidelines to ensure passengers were treated fairly, crediting the twins' courage for pushing the industry toward accountability. For Sarah, life moved on, though it was quieter and humbler than before. Working at the cafe gave her a fresh start, allowing her to rebuild her confidence without the weight of past mistakes looming over her. Over time, she developed meaningful connections with regular customers, learning their stories and finding joy in small moments of kindness. One day, an older woman struck up a conversation about travel, unaware of Sarah's history. "I used to be a flight attendant," Sarah admitted cautiously. The woman smiled warmly, saying, "That must have been such a rewarding job." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "It was, until I learned some hard lessons." Though she never publicly apologized to Marcus and Michael, Sarah found closure in subtle ways. She started volunteering at community events focused on diversity and inclusion, listening to speakers who challenged her perspectives and encouraged growth. At one event, she heard a speaker say, "We can't undo the past, but we can choose how we move forward." Those words resonated deeply with her, becoming a mantra she carried into every interaction. Slowly, she began to see herself not as someone defined by failure, but as someone capable of redemption. The airline, too, emerged stronger from the crisis. Its commitment to reform earned praise from advocacy groups and passengers alike. Customer satisfaction ratings improved, and employees reported feeling more empowered to speak up when they witnessed bias or unfair treatment. Training sessions became opportunities for open dialogue, fostering a culture of accountability and understanding. Though the road to rebuilding trust was long, the company proved that even institutions could evolve when pushed to confront uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, Marcus and Michael reflected on their journey during a quiet evening at home. Sitting on their couch, scrolling through social media, they stumbled upon posts thanking them for inspiring others to stand against injustice. "Can you believe this?" Marcus said with a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Michael grinned, leaning back against the cushions. "Sometimes I wonder if we're still dreaming," he replied. Despite the challenges they'd faced, public scrutiny, emotional exhaustion, and the weight of carrying a movement, they felt proud of what they'd accomplished. But the brothers knew the fight wasn't over. While progress had been made, systemic issues like racial profiling couldn't be solved overnight. They remained committed to their mission, using their platform to amplify marginalized voices and push for lasting change. "Every step counts," Marcus often reminded himself, especially on days when the work felt overwhelming. Together, they'd balanced activism with their entrepreneurial dreams, launching a mentorship program for young Black innovators, a project close to their hearts. As the years passed, the story of Flight 342 became a case study in classrooms and boardrooms, sparking discussions about bias, empathy, and resilience. It served as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of speaking out. For Marcus and Michael, it reinforced the idea that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. For Sarah, it underscored the importance of self-awareness and accountability. And for society, it highlighted the need for constant vigilance in dismantling systems of inequality. In the end, everyone involved learned valuable lessons, not just about fairness or justice, but about humanity itself. The incident on the plane may have started as a single moment of misunderstanding, but it grew into something far greater, a catalyst for change. It reminded people that even the smallest actions can leave lasting impressions, and that, with determination, those impressions can lead to a better, more inclusive world. And so, the story came full circle, not with bitterness or resentment, but with hope. Hope that future generations would inherit a world where everyone belongs, regardless of appearance or background. Hope that courage and compassion would always prevail over prejudice. And hope that someday, stories like theirs wouldn't need to be told, because equality would be the norm, not the exception.